Okay, Michael, would you like to invite the DAC members up to speak about their tasking 5, 6, and 7?
Yes, everyone else, if everyone could go ahead and come in and grab your respective seats, we're going to go ahead and get started. So why don't we go ahead and dive into tasking 5, facility maps.
Well, good morning. I'm Marilyn Moore. I'm the CEO of the Reno Tahoe Airport Authority, and I'm just going to introduce this topic. The Reno Tahoe Airport Authority was particularly interested in the facility maps because we were really one of the early adopters, I think, of the LANCE program, one of the first 6 airports that had the LANCE program, and we had it at Reno Tahoe International. And I think in the initial days of those programs, we probably accounted for a fourth of the LANCE approvals for operation. So really we had a very good tower chief that really helped us out, I think, early on. So we've always had an interest in this area. I've got to tell you that we had a great group working on this, and I'm actually going to turn over the presentation to Dave Messina. But first I want to talk a little bit about him. He is the president and CEO of the First Person View Freedom Coalition, which represents recreational drone users in the United States. And he is a mechanical engineer by education and spent 4 decades at IBM working in a range of jobs in hardware, software, and services doing product development, marketing, sales, and mergers and acquisition jobs. So he retired from IBM in 2018 and started an all-volunteer, not-for-profit, First Person View Freedom Coalition, which represents recreational drone users in the U.S. Color commentary is going to be provided by Dean Schultz, who's the Chief Operating Officer for the Reno Tahoe Airport Authority. And I think Dean has really gained distinction in the airport industry, really being as part of the head of the Safety and Operations Committee for the American Association of Airport Executives, and particularly working on the UAS area and chairing a working group in that area as well. I want to also acknowledge and thank Greg. We had a great resource with CNN. Effie Needham, if you're in the audience here, stand up, because we have some, I think really it's a lot of times the visuals and the videos that demonstrate what we're trying to get across, and Effie was a huge plus on our ability to be able to do that. I also want to acknowledge that we had our GIS coordinator from the Reno Tahoe International Airport, Jed Hammer, that helped with this. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Messina to lead us through what the committee is recommending to the FAA.
Thank you. Our remit for the UAS Facility Maps Tasking Group was to recommend to the FAA improvements to the UAS facility maps with collaboration from the FAA and a range of stakeholders. And that benefits both the unmanned as well as manned aircraft operations. And first and foremost, any changes that we make have to have safety as the top priority. So the team merrily assembled represented airport management, aviation manufacturers, airline and pilots associations, operators of both manned and unmanned aircraft, as well as critical UAS ecosystem software companies. In addition, we had assistance from the FAA UAS Integration Office, and they provided us invaluable help because they were involved in the first pass of the UAS facility maps creation. In addition, they gave us great insight into the availability of data as well as the viability of the recommendations that we'd make. Now we've got an abbreviation and acronym soup here, so let me read off some of the tasks that we had involved. Was the American Association of Airport Executives, Airline Pilots Association International, Airports Council International North America, National Air Traffic Controllers Association, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Academy of Model Aeronautics, New York Fire Department, New York Police Department, my own organization, FPVFC. This group met 5 times across from November through January, and the discussion was healthy. No one group took control or dominated the discussion, and everyone understood in this diverse group that if we're going to open this up again and change the UAS facility maps, then we have the risk that there will be areas where we're going to lower the above ground level or the AGL limit, as we'll refer to it from here on, and that would be warranted by safety. So everyone was comfortable with that. So with this group, the best way to improve the UAS facility maps, we all operators, we came up with this as a problem statement. Now, the team agreed that the UAS facility maps should be updated. It's been 3 years since the UAS facility maps were created, so we have experience from the operators as well as insight into the process. So as the group was keen to maintain high standards of safety of manned aircraft flights, we note here that there are areas around airports where zero AGL makes a lot of sense, and this is informed by the people with local experience. So with this as an agreed to problem statement, we come up with these recommendations. First, refine the grid map. This is where we'll spend most of this presentation. 2 is we'll have a pilot program, and the idea of a pilot program is we will shake down the process looking at the data as well as the process and then roll it out across the country. Now, of course, these are proposals, and we're proposing this to the DAC to be voted on. Now, the third is the who, and this is, so who would do this work? And this is keenly important to us. We understand in many cases the first time the UAS facility maps were created that they used, the folks at the air traffic management used the air traffic policy order JO 7200.23A. It's really a pretty short order, pretty easy to read and understand. Now, this provided sound guidance to instructions to local air traffic management on how to create the UAS facility maps, and our tasking group felt that expanding the responsibility across a stakeholder team would not only spread the workload, but would also increase the buy-in from unmanned and manned operators. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see where we added a takeaway. This is a really diverse team from across the country, and we support refining the UAS facility maps, and the consensus was achieved early and quickly with the process. Now let's get a little more into the detail of the grid refinement. On the tasking group, we had people involved with answering the phone calls as well as placing the phone calls in addition to the extensive experience on the group. So from the experience that we had, we felt it was appropriate that there probably could be changes made to the UAS facility maps across the country. We agreed to increase the amount of airspace for the UAS, and we could do that by making the grid squares or rectangles smaller, which would allow us to hold AGL, say, at 0 or on the airport ground, and then a half mile away, we could raise the altitude to something that would provide sufficient operations and safe operations. Now, the current UAS facility maps have a 1-degree grid square or rectangle. These rectangles are about 1 mile in square, and we agreed to split that in half. Obviously, that's in both directions. So where we have 1 square, we would now have 4. Now, here's an animation to show what we mean. Okay. Now, we've used Dean's Airport. This is Reno Tahoe. And as you zoom back, that's the... Okay, as we zoom back, we'll be able to see that this is an oval that's about 14 by 10 miles across. And with this much space, the allowable above the ground level is about 200 to 300 feet. That's pretty good. Yet, right around the airport, there are rectangles with a lot of zeros in them. And so the question is, can we change any of the grids to allow more altitude for UAS to fly? And we agreed on this approach and split the grids in half. And as you can see, we've got current grids that are smaller and able to create more of a step as we go from at the airport to outside the airport. We're able to create a little more altitude. Okay. Next, the work to change the AGL limits for the new grid structure starts with the right team. The stakeholder team, led by air traffic management, would be responsible for assigning new AGL limits for each of the new grid squares. During the pilot program, the stakeholder team would evaluate the data we have, the data that we've suggested, to determine its utility and to set new AGL limits on the local UAS facility maps, as well as determine if some data sets should be ignored. Now, that team, as we've mentioned briefly, would be led by the air traffic management team. It would include the Air Facility Operator and Management, National Air Traffic Controllers Association, and manned as well as unmanned stakeholders. A point about all of the data that we discussed in the tasking group is that all of the data exists. So we are not recommending the creation of any new data. The data we feel is current, and it will help us provide the stakeholder team sufficient information to provide updates to the refinement and the grid process. So that data includes local surveillance data like departure and arrival tracks, Part 77 takeoff and landing surfaces, and we also talked a fair amount about TERPs and Part 77 with the idea that the stakeholder team should use these standards to inform them, but they should not be strictly adhered to. Also noted in the tasking group, it's really important to include local ATM and local stakeholders, which adds experience and insight into the grid refinement process because of helicopter and local capabilities, medical facilities that would change the AGL restrictions around an airport. Finally, the tasking group recommends that this refinement process be applied to controlled airspaces in classes B, C, D, and E. Now, it was also pointed out during our discussions that airports in Class E airspace may have been viewed with an overly cautious nature because of lack of ATM insight, and also with a good abundance of caution. Now, this animation shows Part 77 approach and takeoff surfaces. Those of you familiar with Part 77 know that three-dimensional surfaces are established for minimum altitudes for aircraft landing and taking off, as well as to provide minimum lateral vertical separation between manned aircraft. Now, that order that I mentioned, the JO 7200.23a, mentioned a 200-foot per nautical mile criteria, which provides good vertical distance, but it did not provide a consistent related lateral guidance. Now, you can see here, remember, we described an oval that was a 10 by 14 mile oval, and so there's good lateral area where we could add to the UAS altitude and have folks be able to fly in those areas off to the sides of the runway. Now, this animation shows San Francisco Airport, where the north-south runways are used alternately with the east-west runways, depending on the wind. Now, we put this forward for future consideration because UAS approval is gained through LANCE, and there could be changes in a dynamic situation that would allow for changes. If it's not in weather, it could be changes that happen maybe longer term for things like construction. And we just wanted to point out that this is a flexible system. This is data that also exists, so no new data sets created, and give us the ability to do something dynamically and on the fly. We also had one additional proposal for the DAC, and that's called shielded operations. Shielded operations is simply flying below a natural or man-made structure. This concept is accepted in New Zealand as a regulation, and it's well received by unmanned and manned operators. The idea is that there would be a nominal lateral distance from the obstruction where no manned aircraft would fly. Again, local insight to things like law enforcement, medical facilities would overrule the possibility of a shielded operation. And here's an animation to show what we've looked like. Now, once again, we've used Dean's Airport. You can see Reno Tahoe as we take off. And now Dean has explained to me that off to the left of the aircraft, there's a mountain range called Rattlesnake Mountain. Now, as we fly away from the airport, you can see a green shaded area, then where we know no manned aircraft would fly. And we know this from track data, obstruction and obstacle databases, as well as local knowledge, all data that exists, no new data sets. So this area would be considered for shielded operations. Next, we take a look at the Reno Tahoe Airport, and then a little farther away, the downtown area. Now, as it turns out, the hotel folks would really like some nice drone videos and photographs to publicize their properties. So the idea is that with a man-made structure, we could create a shielded operation that would safely allow UAS to fly and would be in no way creating any safety issues for manned aircraft. So let's recap what we've covered. The recommendations that we made were created by a really diverse group of aviation professionals. 2, we recommended splitting the UAS grid squares from 1 degree to a half degree. So where there was 1 square, there are now 4. And refining the grid data can be done with existing data. And lastly, very critical, the stakeholder knowledge and experience, including local insight, is critical to get the job done. Now, the next step, or the proposed next step that we would put forward, is that there would be a pilot program. And as we mentioned, the pilot program would shake down the process, identify which pieces of existing data in the grid refinement are useful and which are not. In addition, we put forward 2 criteria that could be used in the selection of both the pilot airports as well as subsequent airports to create a sequence. The first was to create a what is the quartile of zero grid airports and normalize that data. And then the second was that we could identify airports that have a LANCE, quote, further coordination requests or denials. Now, this simply means that in the LANCE process, that if ATM need to get involved, that's a further coordination. And so if we can reduce that with a refined grid size, then that's positive for ATM. It's also positive for the LANCE user because it gets faster response. Finally, the stakeholder team. We spent a fair amount of time talking through which team and what team would be best served that would best serve the process, but at the same time not become ungainly. And we feel that with leading with air traffic, local air traffic management, and gaining participation from NACDA, airport facility operator and management, as well as the stakeholders from manned and unmanned stakeholder teams, it would strike a good balance. That's it. I would like to say a big thank you to Effie, as Marilee mentioned, as well as the folks who participated in 5 separate meetings across November to January. Questions? Sir.
One question about the shielded operations. As you look at, and the FAA calls that masked operations, and there's a bunch of other colloquialisms, but a thought to consider is, do you anticipate assigning an equipage requirement for conducting shielded operations that addresses some of the risk management issues required to handle if you're masked from the satellite and things like that for the actual aircraft themselves? Sometimes the data masked, or not data masked, but the masked operations can actually induce lost links and things like that. Readily mitigated, obviously, but not every drone operator may be as technically proficient as we would like them to be. If we could potentially consider a shielded operation, including as long as you have risk mitigated against EMI and some of those lost link procedures. Do you have an anticipation to do things like that?
Yes, we did. And initially, one of the capabilities was to utilize LANCE. It's a controlled airspace, so that we would be putting forward a request for the flight. And in addition, consistent with the ASTM standard, we'd be requesting a polygon of geometry so that we'd be demonstrating this is exactly where I'm going to fly. So we would be satisfying the who and the where.
Piggybacking off for that question, Houston Mills, UPS. So with the shielded operation, first of all, very nice job. It's very innovative, very creative. I mean, just makes so much sense. Getting close to airports, though, I throw on my man aviation hat, I still get a little creepy when drones get close. So from a shielded perspective, is geofencing connected to that? Because that whole concept seems, very fascinating. So I just wonder, as you guys talk through that, there's different types of command and control that we talked about as well. But from a geofencing perspective, is that incorporated in this particular piece?
It was not, although what was really interesting to me is we had air traffic management from Alaska, from Memphis, Dallas, Reno, Tahoe, of course, and LAX. And they were all very supportive of this. Now, we did have some lively discussion about flying on airport grounds. We did talk about geofencing, but it was not incorporated in the write-up.
I would say from a manned aviation perspective, that's just an added layer of safety, particularly for those type of operations. The closer you get, lost link, you think it's not going to happen, it's going to happen. So that added layer of safety would something I would recommend that we think about.
Yes, thank you. We agree.
Houston, just on the geofencing point, we agree, and at least for our geofencing system, we've used ICAO and FAA principles concerning the approach path in and out of the runways, and I would expect those to generally correspond to the safe LANCE-related areas and altitudes in which to fly, as well as the shielded operations, which reflect, again, the obstacle plane principles under ICAO Annex 14 and FAA Part 77. I also just want to say to the group, really terrific job, actually quite impressive. And as I've said before at the DAC meeting, we would like to see more representation of the small business operators, the drone service providers who are not represented at the high-level DAC. So in terms of the FAA's consideration of adding members, that would be terrific. But I do see reflected in the work of the group the diverse interests that were represented. We didn't work on the group, but I can see that you had the interests of the daily operators in mind, and that's certainly important to us because those are the people who are most directly impacted, including financially, in terms of the constraints on where and when they can fly. So great job in trying to promote innovation and efficiency in the industry.
Good morning, everyone. I don't want to close out Q&A, but I did want to make a comment that as an airport operator, safety is our #1 priority, and so we're very much concerned with that and feel that the recommendations here are still a good balance, but given the experience that we've had in our community of use of drones, a lot of the drone activity is a very localized activity, whether it's for real estate or photography or for construction. So there's a lot of times when a very large grid restricts access to airspace that is not necessarily problematic for the operation of the airport. As you'll see in Reno Tahoe, we have north-south runways primarily. The east-west runway is primarily a general aviation airport or runway, so most of our operations are going north and south, which leaves a lot of airspace east and west that's not actually utilized substantially. So you saw in the first animation, there was a grid that went from 50 to 200. The smaller grids would allow for a more tiered increasing of that airspace, opening up that airspace. And every airport is unique. And as I said, we have parallel runways, but their activity is not symmetrical because of our city and heavier density population on the west side of the airfield. Most all of our aircraft activities are on the east side of the airfield. So the UAS facility maps probably should be looked at in that light and not necessarily symmetrical from that perspective as well. So, and then we did have lengthy conversations on Part 77 and TERPs, and it can get very complicated because there are, for those that are familiar with those parts, they are very complicated, but we didn't want to necessarily get that level of detail because there are some very important services, approach and departure services particularly, that protect manned aircraft operations up to and through an altitude of 500 feet, and then beyond that, they should not be interfering with drone activity. But so we'd encourage the FAA to use those resources, but not necessarily have to implement every aspect of it. We wanted to have some lateral guidance and consistency, but be cautious in not trying to apply every aspect of that. I did also want to emphasize, it was discussed extensively in our conversations, the importance of having stakeholders involved in this go-round. Based on the conversations we had, we've heard many stories where stakeholders were, in some cases, allowed to participate. In other cases, they were just informed what it was going to look like. I think manned as well as unmanned operators, the airport, air traffic controllers, FAA management, all have useful information that can be helped to form these revised UAS facility maps. So strongly encourage that when this process gets underway, that stakeholders are allowed the opportunity to have input into that process. Thank you.
Other questions?
All right, thank you. Comment, Joe DePete Alpha. You know, as was stated earlier, we participated in this and we strongly support the recommendations, with the one caveat being that we're, presupposing or predicated upon the drones acting as expected, right? So there's still the flyaway risk that concerns us a little bit here, but obviously, hopefully, we can work together to try to determine how we can manage that. So it's something to keep in mind.
And if I could real quickly, it's Lauren Cass from American Airlines. I also want to add that I think the process you followed was excellent. It was really a collaborative decision-making sort of approach. We get everybody around the table and everybody's not going to agree, but hearing from each is really important. So I think that this is a good model for any task group to follow. I really do. I'm curious if you set out sort of guidelines after your first meeting and say, is this how we're going to do this? Or did you just let it happen naturally?
We didn't just let it happen. It's 4 decades of herding cats inside an organization that's 10 times as large as the FAA. So it was a great group, and it's just the experience of facilitating a group, listening, and guiding to an endpoint.
Good. And we do, I agree also with Houston and with Joe. Our concern as a large aircraft operator is establishing this airspace. It looks like you've got the right approach. Our concern, of course, is making sure that everything stays where it's supposed to stay, just like we're expected to stay where we're supposed to be as well. So.
Other questions?
No, just to continue on, because I think it's worthy of just taking a look at it. How will the flyaway possibility be addressed? We've talked about geofencing, but just like different manned airspaces, we have different equipment requirements, right? I'm kind of thinking that if you're that in close, that there'd be some prerequisites either for a geofence or some types of alerting systems or whatever to be able to tell flight crews that there's a chance of something happening. Have we gone that far yet to determine how we might handle a remote event like that?
So under the integration pilot program, we are looking at aircraft operations on the airfield. And the air traffic organization recently led a safety panel in that area, looking at all those kind of questions and factors. That panel has completed its work, and the results of the panel are in FAA internal review from safety oversight. And as soon as that's complete, we'll be able to release those results. I think that'll give a good indication of the kind of hazards, risks, and potential mitigations that might be useful in and around the airport area.
And from a recreational perspective, this is a great plug for STEM. We've got so from recreational users, flyaways are never good. You're losing your expensive device, but it's also not safe. And so we've got a number of either fail-safe devices or fail-safe coupled with devices that would be compliant with the minimum kinetic energy requirements, be it a parachute or what have you. So this is front of mind in the recreational space as well.
I'd like to add on to that the UAS IPP, we just did flight operations at the Eisenhower International Airport. So thank you, Dean, for the risk you assumed as being in this kind of leadership position. It's not an easy task. I think part of your answer maybe comes from Task Group 3's findings. and how we talk about while surface, Part 77 surfaces identify areas that you could legally be, there's places you shouldn't without a certain level of training and certification and some kind of we do have a box within aviation that works exceptionally well. State of Kansas, as operators that are fostering an ecosystem that really want every operator to be able to have full access, as part of IPP, focus very heavily on formalized training procedures to say you are authorized to operate in this kind of airspace. If you are going to operate within a Class B where there's heavies and other aircraft that are significant, you need to have that specialized training to deal with emergency procedures, just like any manned aircraft is going to have emergency procedures. A lost link situation has a very prescribed model on how to do that safely. But I wouldn't put 18-year-old that has the Costco drone out there and trust he's going to do his emergency, his boldface well. So we do require that in Kansas for how we do operations in these advanced UAS operations to say not all places are appropriate, but sufficient and proper training that's validated and someone's checked them out. All 2 thumbs up, great, welcome to Eisenhower International. And I'll tell you, it's a little intimidating to stand on 29 left with a drone when they're clearing aircraft for land on 29 right. So every rated pilot turned around to final approach and looked every single time we heard that clearance on the radio to make sure that manned pilot was on the right runway. But those training and certifications are a thing, and they can be just as a thing in UAS as anywhere else.
Hey, Bob, I was just going to add to your thought because this really kind of comes back to the whole access to airspace. I think there's some interconnectivity between this really good effort. And as that continues to evolve, you made me think about certification, qualification. The closer you get, the higher the risk. And so that access is really what needs to, so it seems like this great initiative really needs to be interlinked with that access as well.
And I will say, as a rule, everyone that participated on this panel was very respectful of the fact that, integration, safe integration was paramount and top of mind. So there wasn't a huge push from anyone in particular to, we need access to every square inch of airspace. Everyone was very respectful. So we're not actually suggesting or recommending that the airspace in closest, proximity to an airport should now suddenly be opened up. In fact, we did have many hours of conversation about zeros on airports and as a standard and starting point. And I think it was pretty much agreed that it was necessary to have, all airport property zeros, but then airport operators like myself may want to actually use a drone in certain situations as well for various activities. And so that's going to be an item or an issue that still needs to be worked out, but there was no advocation for opening up the airspace over the top or underneath the approach and departure paths of runways.
Thank you very much. Great questions.
Gentlemen, I just have one quick question for you. Sorry
Yes, sir.
about that. I was going to do this, Dave, anyway. What surprised you? What in this, all the conversations, other than you mentioned, was there anything just complete surprises you didn't expect, topics surfaced?
There absolutely was a surprise, and it keys on what Dean just said. I was blown away that people who do this for a living were really open to opening up their airspace. I mean, and it sounds cute, but I really was surprised. I mean, I'm coming in from a recreational drone perspective. It's like, ooh, you guys are you're frequently careless and clueless. But there was a view that, no, we should do this. And that really surprised me, that there was a agreement across the group, and it happened early on. And that allowed us to have a good discussion from there forward. Good point. Great. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, excellent work. Well, sure, let's keep this great momentum up and let's go into the next tasking, number 6, the BV loss challenges.
Dave, Jan, and Sean, if you could come up and join me too for your section, that'd be great. Okay, with the lack of caffeine, hopefully this doesn't put everybody to sleep. We had quite a topic to cover. I have to say, well, let me back up. For those of you who don't know me, Todd Gratz. I've been on the DAC since 2016, DAC 1.0, and was very proud to be given this opportunity to work with so many people on a very complex topic, something that we at my company have been involved with since the early days. But it was just outstanding to get the variety of perspectives that we received through this effort. We actually had, interesting enough, only about 60, call it maybe 70 days, actual working days, allotted between the tasking and today's meeting. We had some holidays in between that I'm sure many of you faced with the other committees, and quite proud of the work everyone did. When you look at the group, back to diversity of group, I didn't put out a list in our slides as far as who joined, just to protect them from any incrimination. I can take all the heat here if there's any recommendations that are not popular, but great organizations: Amazon Prime Air, L3 Harris, AVSI, our friend Mark from the Dallas Helicopter Unit, FPV, Freedom Coalition, New Air, Precision Hawk, DJI, Verizon Skyward, NACTA. We had a very strong representation, obviously, from UPS Flight Forward, AirMap, Boeing, NBA. It was a great group of individuals, and very proud of the work. And so obviously they'll be doing a majority of the presentation. I do want to say there is a little bit of a disclaimer. The ebook that was distributed, there is a clerical error, and I'll get into that. It was my error that I made, and we'll talk about that when we get into to Tony's section, which is the autonomy section. So with that, next slide, please. I have got the pointer. I'm sorry. One other thing is that it was a little bit of a scientific process we went about when we put this together, and that was how we structured the meeting. So every topic was voted on. Constituency was voted on. Time frame was voted on. We had a very democratic process, which again was only possible because of the quality of the individuals that were on the effort. So. With that, we'll get into the first subgroup for BV loss, and that is certification. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Sean Cassidy.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Sean Cassidy, Director of Safety and Regulatory Affairs for Amazon Prime Air. One of the things that I would like to lead off with, and it's a little bit reflective of some comments, Houston, that you made about access and certification and the like, is that we're looking at this set of recommendations, which I will put up right here, as kind of a continuum of items that will allow an applicant to start out with a fairly constrained process by which they can meet the requirements by statute to get into initial operations and then kind of evolve over time. So what I'd like you to do when you look at this set of recommendations, yes, they're about BV loss. Yes, they're about certification, but it's really kind of a sequential approach that will get us from very constrained, kind of an ad hoc approach to getting initial operating authority, both for the vehicle and the economic and operating authority, and then hopefully evolve into a kind of a more normalized approach to meeting the requirements as defined by the statutes to have airworthiness through minimum safety requirements and also achieve the bar in order to become validated through air operating certificates and the like. So this is a very timely conversation because we are right in the middle of a comment period for a policy change as regards 2117B for special class aircraft. Now, that rule was never envisioned to be applied to unmanned systems. It was written some time ago with a mind towards lighter than air and gliders and the like. So I think it's a very positive step forward that there's a bit of rulemaking out there that will codify the fact that you can actually apply 2117B as a means of compliance for a special class aircraft for an unmanned system. Now, that's just the beginning, because what we think is equally important is that under this kind of risk-based approach is that initially we have this new kind of approach called durability and reliability, which is essentially almost like an output-based approach to certification where you have an applicant that comes in with the system. They look to do a certain kind of operation over a certain population density. They go through a test and evaluation campaign against airworthiness requirements, which translates into a number of hours that gets evaluated, and then assuming they meet all those conditions, then they can get issued a type certificate. Now, that was initially kind of a little bit more oriented towards your typical IPP crowd, small UAS operating underneath 55 pounds. Under a risk-based approach, and a true performance and risk-based approach, it should be agnostic actually to the weight of the vehicle. And I think that is reflected in some of the approaches and the comments in the policy. So what we are suggesting is that now that we're into rulemaking, now that we're looking at the next step beyond this initial rule, and identifying airworthiness requirements, and then furthermore, looking at the current advisory guidance out there, is that we should be very purposeful in saying, look, you can take an approach that would perhaps look at a certain test case in which you have a certain obligation for flight hours, but you should also incorporate reliability data, fault tree analysis, failure mode analysis, and the like, and allow for a more refined allocation of those hours, which would lead to a type certification. So a true performance and risk-based approach. The second part of the recommendation is kind of the bridge plan. So we have the 44807 statute, which allowed for certain category of aircraft to be allowed to enter and be put into commercial service minus the requirements under 44704, I think it is, which is the type and production certs and all those things. I think it's equally important that when we have the ability to leverage this 44807, which does not expire by statute until 2023, that for those applicants, those operators who have a bona fide type certificate effort, who are going through all these hoops, who are working very closely with flight standards and the air certification branch and the like, that they ensure that they can have the continuity of the service from the point they're operating under 44807 and up to the point that they get to the actual type certificate. So I think it's very, very important, as did the group. Now, this is just not me speaking, even though I'm talking to the first person, that was a recurring theme within the group, that they need this continuity of service that goes from the exemption to the type certificate. The third part is kind of what Houston was talking about, and is a little bit related to the previous presentation, is kind of normalizing the means by which we can actually realize beyond visual line of sight operations. Because right now it's kind of a bifurcated approach. If you are an applicant that goes and applies under a streamlined or a durability and reliability type of construct, essentially what you're doing is you're certifying the system, and you're certifying it against ground risk essentially. And then you're looking to demonstrate that you have the ability to operate in a certain operational environment under beyond visual line of sight conditions, minus a visual observer, true beyond visual line of sight. And that's kind of a shared responsibility through achieving some of it through the design side, onboard sensors, whatever equipage that you incorporate, as well as working with flight standards and working through the operational approvals, which show that you have sufficient mitigation against the risk. Now, what's very muddy right now is how does that relationship actually work, and how does that translate to an applicant who's coming in for a type certificate, so that they don't just basically go through the TC effort and then basically can't operationalize because they haven't had a clear path to demonstrate those mitigations. So what that means is we're looking to get a lot more clarity around what's the role of the air certification branch, what's the role of flight standards, how does ATO fit into this thing? Because not too long ago there was a agreement between the air traffic organization and flight standards in terms of roles and responsibilities as regards safety risk assessments and permissions. Some of that was incorporated into the air traffic controller's handbook. Some of that's still a little bit gray, from the applicant standpoint. So the more we can kind of clean up those swim lanes and understand how we go through that process of kind of getting normalized beyond visual line of sight operations would be very beneficial for the industry. And then the final thing is a little bit of a look forward. It's now that we've kind of gone through these first three hoops, how do you eventually get from this kind of ad hoc approach to getting through a type certification and an operation certification? And we need to start thinking about what are the next steps. Right now, we're in the 44807 world, which is kind of a one-and-done situation. You bring your vehicle before the aircraft evaluation group. You go through an initial evaluation against certain potential failure conditions, and then you get signed off. That's kind of where we are right now. That's moving into a more kind of agile, performance and risk-based type certification process. But again, that's still kind of a very one-off case-based, very ad hoc based approach towards type certification and operations. We should already start to be thinking about what are the next steps. And what the group is advocating for is that we start working on that right now. We have a discrete working group and look at what changes do we need to the rule set that can then realize normalized operations, much like any other Part 135 carrier would realize, where they don't have to go to a specific location and a specific piece of airspace and get a certificate of authorization and kind of a unique kind of ad hoc approval. That's really not a right now thing, but it's something, given the kind of gestational period for rulemaking, that we really need to be thinking about right now. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. This is basically a continuum from the very near term, 44807, the initial instances of the durability and reliability TC, and then looking a little bit further towards kind of a very purposeful built set of rules that will facilitate UAS operations.
Hey, just a comment, Sean, very good review. And Jay, I guess this is more for the FAA. I know Sean had mentioned that the current 807 expires in September 2023 by law, but I think there's a current FAA policy that basically shuts it off in October of this year, and anticipating the certification process moving forward. So my question is the FAA making a pathway forward to ensure that that exemption still has pathway in accordance with the law in case the certification process doesn't pan out? Because I know that's planned for Q2 or Q3, I believe, but just wondered, is there an alternative pathway in case that doesn't happen?
Okay, well, it's a good thing I have general counsel by my side because Arjun can poke me if I say something. So 44807 does not expire in October. The IPP expires in October, and the operations under the IPP, as a result of the IPP expiring, would lose that exemption. But we're looking at what the post-IPP world looks like. So I don't want anyone to take that comment as, November 1st, anyone in the IPP can't fly, right? But we are, in fact, looking at a number of bridging activities between 44807. 44807 is also a part of the base 107 regulation. And we realize there are a number of things policy-wise, regulatory-wise, that we need to put in place before that 44807 exemption expires. The good news is we are seeing significant positive response to the message that people need to get their aircraft certified. And we're also seeing that aircraft certification, as Sean's pointed out, some of the methodologies they're using, and the fact that they've now issued the notice in the Federal Register about using the special category. Aircraft certs really pivoted. They're doing a lot of work in this area. It is leading edge work, so it's sometimes difficult and painful for the participants, but we're forging that path for these new drones. Early in the summer, we had approximately 12 programs that were moving towards certification. Depending on how you count it, we are now up to approximately 40. So we're seeing, and we've been emphasizing more and more with industry, aircraft cert, flight standards, the integration office. We've all been emphasizing the real key, one of the keys to unlocking operating not just BV loss, but operating to a rule in any part beyond 107 is a type certification or an airworthiness determination. And I feel very positive that aircraft certification and flight standards are helping us get there. I see industry wanting to get there. So the answer is yes, we do know there's a need for a bridge, and we're forming that bridge. And the good news is everyone's responding.
All right, got it, pilot. Pilot error. Excuse me.
Do we require further training on the
I think you might
microphones?
require a little further training. This might be my last shot.
Microphone IOB.
Anyway, no, ALPA sees this, 2117B and these approaches as a good step towards a more industry-based set of certification standards, so supportive of it as long as we try to move quickly towards that. I realize that's kind of a catch-22 because you have to understand the mission and the operations, but that's the end state, right, is to have a set of acceptable industry certification standards. So.
Well, I think the end state's probably something that doesn't recognize UAS as a special class aircraft.
Yeah.
I mean, it should really be recognized eventually down
another
the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I hinted towards that,
Yeah.
operating to the
That's the right side of the slide, is when we get to the normalized operations, these should not be looked upon as kind of these unicorns. They should be looked upon as normalized systems that are fully integrated into the
Fully
next.
integration. Yep.
And I can assure you, any of us working with this industry, there's no one in this industry wants to move slowly. But they all do want to move safely, so.
Can I leave now? All right.
This subgroup was made for your inner geek. And so as we got into this, there were about 13 folks initially, and then as we proceeded, we had about 20 folks join. And that I took as a real compliment to the work that we were doing, as well as the importance of the work. Now, one of the things that we brought is that this has everything to do with working across the boundaries of two federal agencies. And so whenever that happens, we know that frequently council might be involved, leadership might be involved. And so this was an aspect that behind the scenes, Todd was outstanding and really backed us up, so that we had great discussions and they were animated. And every word that you will see has been approved and vetted by the entire team. And so general consensus is not a phrase that I would use, but we absolutely gained unanimous agreement on everything that we put forward. And so that's a good thing. So when we started this problem, for those of you who don't know, has been around for over 12 years. And so we also knew, and I'm very gratified by the maturity of the people on the sub-team, that we would be critical of the FAA in this work. And we take that very seriously, and we take it with caution that what is it that we're going to say exactly, because our goal and our mode of operation is to work collaboratively. So with that as a premise, we immediately jumped into Section 374. And if you don't have your 2018 Reauthorization Act memorized, that has to do with C-band and L-band. And so there's a little summary right here. It has the Congress mandates that the FAA work with the FCC and the NTIA. And before working on this subgroup, I didn't know that the NTIA existed. I do now. It's not a knock, it's just my ignorance on the subject. And so looking at Section 374, as luck would have it, there was the Spectrum office within the FAA led a request for stakeholders on October 19, 2019, with comments back due November 19, 2019. So as we kicked off, we asked for the comments back, because that was all about this spectrum area and the class B, class L, C and L, pardon me. So the bands. So we were declined access until late in the process. So what we did is we went out and through the members of the group, we were able to gather much of the feedback, and it was not very complimentary. So what we put together from that is a summary of the statements, and that distillation is our problem statements. Now, I apologize, these are the font on this is a little small, but as I say, we carefully vetted every statement here. So very quickly, as of December 2019, the FAA, FCC, and NTIA do not appear to be coordinating on a single report addressing the allocated L-band and C-band for the UAS operations. Now, you recall from the previous slide that was part of the mandate in Section 374. The FAA, in its request for the stakeholder, failed to mention or acknowledge standards. So this got a lot of discussion. And again, we thank Todd for his leadership in the overall group that we are okay to proceed with this, this type of problem statement. The third one, industry leaders provided stakeholder feedback, the document that I recommended. And we felt that there were some statements that were not entirely accurate. So we seek to clarify those as part of the resolutions. The fourth is the lack of spectrum regulation that enable beyond visual line of sight missions and ensure safety of operations is hampering commercial growth. So this is a bit of Captain Obvious, but it warranted stating as part of the problem statement. So the recommendations, we've got a couple of pages of those, is that the FAA should engage both the intra-agency and inter-agency across FAA, FCC, and NTIA. Now, so we clearly understand that this subgroup has the remit by the FAA DAC. So we are not trying to go beyond our remit and assert a cross-administration activity. So from here, what we're proposing is that the FAA work collaboratively with these other organizations. And again, I hope you feel and hear the anxiety in my voice. This was taken very seriously and is a very sensitive topic. And so we do these with the greatest respect. UAS operators, along with spectrum, will be diverse in UAS operations. All spectrum requirements must consider safety. In the write-up that we saw, that was not necessarily the first tenet that safety comes first. There were things like sharing spectrum with terrestrial use, and that as well as a recommendation that the terrestrial users would give up bandwidth in times of high use. That didn't seem practical or prudent to us. In addition, the World Radio Conference of 2007-2012, as I mentioned, this problem has been around for a while. Allocated spectrum to be made available to the UAS in the C-band and L-band. So the FAA should assert its oversight by use and take lead to ensure that spectrum is maintained for the use of the UAS. Any consideration of sharing or auction must maintain safety primacy for UAS. And so as we're observing spectrum being auctioned by the FCC, that's what this is about. Additional recommendations, last page, is that the three agencies working within their bounds and jurisdictional competencies should work closely together. Now, this is some statement of common sense, but this got us a fair amount of discussion, and this is asking for a way to work with other organizations, and that's really what we're putting forward. Is that define the strengths, define what the central missions are of the various organizations, and come together and work together through these problems. We further suggested that a single or individual champion frequently helps when you're working on cross-organizational or cross-agency situations, certainly in my experience working across large organizations. And as I hinted at, finally, the FAA should assess the existing work already completed and standards already created and in progress. So there's been a lot of great work done, notably in the IPPs, that we wanted to take advantage of, and that's what we're encouraging. So the one thing that we put forward is that as this group grew to 20 people, we really had a brain trust that had part of their time working with the FCC, part of their time working with the FAA. So this is a group that wants to help, wants to collaborate, and we've got their names and numbers, and they're available as this whole work progresses. Questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so the last line, could you expand on the last line in the last slide, please?
I will try.
This work should include recognizing commercial cellular. How significantly was that discussed?
Or relatively significantly. This was brought to the table by the two large cellular providers, and there was a discussion that can it work explicitly? Can it not? Do we have to aim terrestrial antennas skyward? So this was discussed significantly, and even to the point of, well, we think maybe it's outside of the remit of the Section 374. Well, we felt not as a group and came to agreement. That's why it's here. So certainly well discussed. Would be happy to share some of the details of that, but that was thoughtful discussion, and we had, as I say, folks from the cellular companies on the board, as well as AIA and other aerospace associations, as well as airframe manufacturers that took a different approach.
Okay. I have a quick follow-up as well. I know this was, your focus was on enabling BVLOS, but was there any discussion at all about the potential to use segregated spectrum did security come up? Right, so in other words, if hobbyists were in a unlicensed spectrum and commercial operations were somewhat segregated into other spectrum, did it come up at all that there was a potential security aspect, a positive security aspect to separating or segregating spectrum for command and control?
We tried to separate the discussion by mission, and so we thought that was, it did not come up with respect to security as an input into that mission differentiation. But there was a lot of discussion about what's a better way to split this up. And because the documents that were put forward by the Spectrum Office in October had a one-size-fits-all, and that was met with a lot of rebuttal by many of the respondents. And their view was, hey, this really needs to be broken down by what are you doing? And so is it beyond visual line of sight? What altitude? Is it cargo, et cetera? So not so much security, but absolutely on mission.
Thank you.
Yes,
So just to sort of foot stomp on I'm appreciative that you're working with the NTIA. I think that's important because, as you know, they're representing all the other government departments and agencies. And just to bring up for this community, I mean, with a lot of the national security considerations going on now in the 5G world, the Defense Department at the undersecretary level has focused, task forces looking at even the spectrum issues, right? And so as we evolve this and as many things happen in this broader, Internet of Things, very complex, congested electromagnetic spectrum, we're going to just have to be aware of a lot of other moving parts. So coordinating at that NTI level, I think, is going to be really important as many other, governmental considerations come into play.
Agreed. Other questions or comments? Okay, thank you. Next up is Jen.
Thank you, Dave. So detect and avoid is a key piece of the puzzle for enabling beyond visual line of sight operations. Our group has come up with 4 recommendations that you see on the screen. And I'd say that you've seen these recommendations before from other groups in other contexts, and that just speaks to the importance of these elements. I'm just going to walk through them in general and then take the questions. So we need a framework essentially for, in the near term, operational approvals, waivers, and then ultimately, as Sean has highlighted, for type certification. There are several standards development organizations who are currently engaged in the development of performance standards and test methodologies for DAA systems. So it's key that FAA ultimately, once these standards are published, to accept them as means of compliance for these systems. Otherwise, you don't really have any targets to work towards from a design and development standpoint. Along the lines of accepted means of compliance, our group felt that there are certainly some operating environments in which a DAA system may not actually be required. And Dave pointed out that those are characterized as shielded or masked operations, where you're in close proximity to a structure or perhaps deep terrain or terrain features, which puts you in a place where you would not be a significant risk to a manned operation. And so this doesn't mean that there aren't other safety mitigations and technology solutions required for that operation. It doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't have collision avoidance, but it means that perhaps in the truest sense of detect and avoid, that such a system would not be required for those, meaning to remain well clear. So thirdly, until those performance standards and test methodologies, until those standards have been published, there's a bit of a gap. And particularly until there's equipment available that meets those standards, that operators can and OEMs can put on their UAS and make them compliant. So to fill that gap, there have been lots of lessons learned, and safe operations have been proven out, so to speak, through the IPP and PSP programs, projects that have been in close collaboration with the FAA. So what kind of menu of strategic and tactical mitigations related to air risk can we take from those lessons learned and provide to the broader industry to safely and slowly expand BVLOS operations while we're still in sort of the waiver game? And then finally, sort of looking forward and thinking about operations in integrated airspace and outside the mode CVAL, non-cooperative detect and avoid remains a significant technology challenge. Lots of folks are working on it. There are lots of sensor solutions that are in work. But if we think about this sort of in the long term, what can we do to say yes to technologies that would facilitate collaboration between manned and unmanned aircraft in the interest of safety? Could we work towards a technology solution, and maybe it's not a single solution, but things like vehicle-to-vehicle technology, maybe it's a transceiver, a traffic beacon, that reports the minimum information between aircraft to facilitate collision avoidance. So these are the recommendations of the DAA subgroup. Are there any questions?
Yes, I have just a question, or actually a comment. Again, this is I think we just need to keep an eye on ensuring that the FAA is doing good, close cooperation across the interagency. And I'm specifically pointing to NASA and the Defense Department, where, for instance, the Air Force Research Lab for well over a decade has been working on these detection and avoidance technologies, algorithms. And for instance, one great example is basically the collaboration between NASA, the Air Force, and Lockheed Martin, how we basically developed this ground collision avoidance system. All right, so you have a F-16 pilot goes into high G maneuver, blacks out, and the airplane completely goes into automated mode and essentially prevents the controlled flight into terrain. There are now these technologies about making sure that we don't have, when you have manned, unmanned teams of aircraft, that they're not bumping to each other, which is essentially kind of the problem we're dealing with. So when we talk about industry and other aviation stakeholders, I just want us to be aware that there's a broad, rich set of activities going on that are completely unclassified, and we need to be able to make sure that this community taps into a lot of that activity.
Certainly, and we have to be mindful of the range of UAS and the swap considerations and what the larger UAS can do versus the smaller ones. But I totally agree, yes.
This one I had a thought as well, Robbie. This is definitely a cornerstone, with BV loss. And so I know from an aviation perspective, and we talked about this from FARs, it's seen a void. That's really the threshold. If you're going to, create something equal or equivalent level of safety, what's that mathematically? Is that 10 to the minus ninth? I just think there's got to be a solution to that. And if the seen void is a math, and I'm not a math guy, I know you're a math guy, Robbie, but if it is a mathematical probability in terms of risk mitigation, and it would seem to me that, that's where we wanted to try to find something that was equivalent or acceptable from a DAA perspective. So whatever that math is, it seems to me that should be one of those cornerstone pieces. But I'm sure NASA and others, we've had similar discussions with, the carriage of lithium batteries. And I know, here in this actual facility years ago when Deborah Hirschman was the chairman, we talked about lithium battery carriage. And there's a lot of concerns about safe carriage of lithium batteries. And we talked about, and NASA was here. And they educate a lot of folks and said, the probability of spontaneous activity with those batteries is 10 to the minus ninth. And so they've got these batteries, on the International Space Station and others. Very, very safe, but it's all math. And so it's just another thought. So as we're talking about what this looks like and how do we get there, I think we need to bring, that level of detail into this conversation.
And we should be mindful that there's a difference between operational safety and system safety. We've got to bring them both together in the appropriate way. Thank you.
Jen, I've got one last comment. Just regarding your last bullet there, I'd just like to second it as a manufacturer of DAA types of equipment, and we have some on the market and others that are in work, and we keep an eye on what's happening in the industry across all various types of technologies. There's a real seems to be concern out there that what's on the market now isn't going to get us where we need to be to enable us, or even not just on the market, but on some of the technologies that are being tested. Maybe just from a performance perspective, but maybe also from cost perspective, maybe from cost of spectrum perspective, right? So there really is a need for FAA to sort of help let us know where you see promise so that we can direct our activities in certain areas. Right?
Well, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, we, under the IPP and in working with our colleagues who work on the standards committees, we are seeing a need to create a larger DAA framework in that DAA is one term, but we realize it applies in many ways, many levels of performance. And we're preparing to engage industry in a conversation of what does that framework look like and how can we best use it. We are committed to a performance-based standards approach. So any of the technologies that we would want to give people credit for in terms of risk mitigation, we would like to see move towards industry-based consensus standards. And we do have some of those already, but they're mostly focused on the large aircraft that can carry large systems and generate a tremendous amount of electricity energy. So we're seeing more promise in the solutions in DAA, both in electro-optical and ADS-B-in and other technologies. We're working with folks to establish what's the right performance for the missions they're going towards, foreshadowing what the autonomy folks are going to tell us. But yeah, we're headed in that direction.
All right, thanks.
So I'm good for James at Wing. I am not Tony Nannini, but I am standing in for him. And he did a wonderful job on this group. And this is obviously a big topic, so I'm not going to claim to be the end-all expert. Before I forget, I hinted at a clerical error. If you have the public ebook there, you'd think after what I have about 6 years in high school, 8 years undergrad, I would my clerical skills would be a little bit higher. but I missed correcting the deck and the ebook, so forgive me. So the deck is a little bit different than the front of the ebook, but the bottom line is these are the recommendations that we're making, and we'll get that ebook corrected. So with that, the original recommendation number 1 is removed. Our friends at ALPA pointed out very wisely that we were referencing a document that's yet to be finalized, and so until that's finalized, probably not best to reference it. The key in all the recommendations, I'm assuming everyone read the slides, but I think the areas to highlight that the autonomy group wanted me to highlight, that is the fact that we really are looking for performance-based requirements, right? And across the board, performance-based requirements, standards, they'll help move this forward, help us take advantage of what this technology can bring, and really look at things on a kind of a broader scale, right? So non-mission specific risk profiles, right? And then give that to industry to meet the performance requirements. If you go to slide 2, the second thing is, again, looking at the net benefit of what we're doing here. That's a highlight. And we've, in our effort, both as it pertains to our activities with the FAA for BV loss, as well as just everything we look at technically as we entertain new technologies at the railroad, is to look at the net benefit of what we're doing, and simply not on a cost basis at all, but looking at what's the net benefit of these rulemaking activities or our activities, and what does that do for safety? How does that actually improve safety? We certainly don't want to add risk, but let's also look at what is that bottom line benefit of automated systems? Again, I'll use us as an example. We add a certain amount of drone inspection to the track in a beyond visual line of sight manner that adds the frequency of inspection, reduces the human occupancy. That's a net win. And I think we want to look at that the same way across the board for all usage of drones, is how do we show both to the communities we all engage with and just the NAS in general, the net benefit of these efforts. And then I think lastly, again, looking at operational risk level to include the consideration of those risks and safety benefits. So that's it for autonomy. Again, I'm more than happy to go into some of the specifics, but the net of it, this was a really broad group. They had a very large subject in this subgroup to tackle, and it was pretty admirable the amount of time they did it in.
So Todd, a clarifying question. While you called the subgroup autonomy, in the FAA response, we will most likely address the bullets that you gave us rather than the general term autonomy.
Understood. Okay.
Because autonomy is a very difficult thing to respond to in toto.
Understood. We had a whole conference call of what to call it. So we understand.
So we're going to
broad.
ignore the title and address the recommendations. How's that?
That sounds great.
Okay, perfect.
Anything else?
Any other questions for autonomy or any of the other subsections for BV loss? Terrific. Well, I would like to thank the entire BV loss team for an excellent presentation and spawning some very good discussion questions. We are coming upon exactly noon. We're going to go ahead and go into our lunch break. We will reconvene at 1:15. So we'll get started a little bit sooner, and we're ahead of schedule, so anticipating an early end to the day as we then tackle our few last remaining open items. So everyone be back here, please, by 1:15. Thank you.